Hey everyone, welcome to today's mini booth gathering and a joyous Easter wish for all of you. Jessica's going to be along in just a moment with some new music, at least in our context, new music, which is exciting. And then I'll be back to tell you a resurrection parable. Here we go.
Broken and scattered, in mercy gathered, mended and whole, empty-handed, but not forsaken. I've been set free, I've been set free. Oh, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, whoa, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see you now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes. You're laying yourself down. You're raising up the broken to life. You take our failure, you take our weakness, you set your treasure in jars of clay. So take this heart, Lord, I'll be your vessel, the world to see your life in me. Oh, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, whoa, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see you now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes. You're laying yourself down. You're raising up the broken to life. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Whoa, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see you now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes. Laying yourself down. You're raising up the broken to life.
Thanks, Jess. Good to have you back with some new music. Really appreciate it. Parables are an ancient story form, and unless you kind of grew up around texts that contained them, the teachings of Jesus, for example, they might not be that familiar a form, but a thing to remember about parables is that they were designed either to sit alongside another story, kind of as a contrast, compare, a provocation, or even sometimes within their own structure, they contain things that, when you put them side by side, really raised questions more than they answered questions. And what I want to do today is I want to share a contemporary Easter parable with you. This is a true story, as told by Don Hutchings. Don is a priest in just north of Toronto. I've edited a little bit for our context, but this is her story as she related it. When I was young, I used to live on the edge of the downtown east side of Vancouver. I was just starting out, and so the edge of downtown was what I could afford. The place has been gentrified since then. There's no way I could ever afford to live there these days. Back then, it was a pretty rough part of Vancouver. Some people, like my parents, for example, said that it was far too dangerous a place for me to live, but I was young and unafraid, and the colorful characters that inhabited the neighborhood just added to the excitement of living downtown. Besides, my apartment was located on the edge of the east side, so I like to pretend that the sex workers and the addicts didn't actually live in my neighborhood, but rather that they only worked there. And work they did, turning tricks or begging for money so that they could support their habit with a fix. It was a pretty scary place when I first moved in, but over time I learned to live with people who I had once feared. I certainly got to know some pretty colorful characters, but none more colorful than Big Ed. On days like today, on Easter, Big Ed looms large in my eyes. Sometimes it's as if it was only yesterday that Big Ed was shepherding me through the old neighborhood. I don't mind telling you that the first time I ever saw Big Ed, he frightened the life out of me. Ed was, as his name suggests, a big guy, and he didn't smell very good. He surprised me one evening after I'd parked my car. Parking spots were at a premium, and so I often had to park several blocks from my apartment. Ed stood looming over me as I struggled to get my briefcase out of the trunk without dropping my groceries. With a big smile plastered on his face, Ed asked me if I needed a hand. I told him I could manage just fine, but Ed insisted that this was not a safe place for a young woman to be on her own so late at night, so he would have to walk me home. Ed was a big guy. A big, dirty, smelly guy. These days, we'd identify Ed as Indigenous. Back then, I would have said Ed was a member of a First Nation or that he was a Native Canadian, but I quickly learned that Ed hated all those labels. Ed identified himself as an Indian. In fact, Ed always said that he was a big red Injun, because that's what the white man named him. I'm an Injun because the white man says I am, but I'm big and red because that's what the good Lord made me, Ed insisted, sometimes even shouted. I ain't no part of no First Nation. That's just the white man trying to feel better about stealing what ain't mine and sure ain't his. And I ain't no native, because nobody belongs in this mess. I'm from the country, from the mountains where my people lived, all the way back to before anybody can even remember. Ed told me all about himself as he walked me home almost every evening. Ed took care of me on the streets, like he took care of all his people. No matter how hard we tried, none of us could ever get Ed to clean himself up or do anything to get himself off the street. We listened to his stories, and we'd give him $1 here or there. Sometimes we'd buy him a meal. Ed was always grateful for whatever anybody gave him, and Ed would always share whenever he received with folks Ed said needed the help more than he did. In the years that I knew Ed, he often asked me to help folks that he, Big Ed, was looking out for. On Sundays, when I couldn't get away from the city, I used to attend the Anglican church just down the road from my apartment. On most of those Sundays, Ed would escort me to the door of the church, but he would never come in. Ed said he loved Jesus, but he couldn't stomach the priests. The priests had raised Ed in that school where the white man forced him to live. The priests had beaten him and done all sorts of unspeakable things it wasn't polite to tell a young lady. Ed shouted on more than one occasion that he would never, ever set foot in a church. Never. When he walked me to the church, Ed always asked me to just go inside and talk to Jesus and tell Jesus that his friend Ed was doing just fine, thank you, and that Lord willing, he'd be along soon enough to see him. Ed was usually waiting at the church door when the service was over. He'd hit parishioners up for loose change. Ed didn't take drugs. He hated drugs and would rail against them. He said drugs were dreamed up by the white man to keep folks like him in his place. But he said that he was smarter than that because he had his dreams. According to Ed, the white man labeled him mentally ill because they just didn't understand his dreams. But one day, he'd show them. One evening as Ed was walking me to my door, he told me that he had to go away. He told me not to worry if I didn't see him for a while because he had to go off and do battle with some demons. Ed told me not to worry because he'd be back just as soon as he sorted out those demons. He told me not to believe it if anyone said he'd been killed, and not to worry if he ended up dead, because he'd be back no matter what. I didn't know what to say, so I gave Ed a few dollars for his journey, told him I'd miss him. That was the last time I ever saw Ed. A few weeks later, the word on the street was that they'd found Big Ed in an alley with a needle sticking out of his arm and another needle lying next to him. None of the folks on the street believed that Ed did that to himself. They all knew how much Ed hated drugs. There was a police investigation, and there were a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of theories about what might have happened. Big Ed had always been a larger-than-life sort of guy. In death, Ed rose to mythical heights. And I got to tell you that there were more than one or two of us who half believed that we'd see Big Ed again. I mean, he told more than a few of us that he would return. And Ed always kept his promises. The young vicar at the church asked me if I'd help to organize a memorial service for Ed. So we put the word out that the service would take place and what the appointed hour was, and I arrived there at that time to find all sorts of characters outside. The young vicar was trying to convince folks to come inside the church, but they all insisted that Big Ed would never set foot inside the church when he was living, and they weren't about to drag him in there now. So we walked over to the park, and folks told their stories about Big Ed. That big red engine touched each of our lives. There were so many stories about how Ed's smile, his words, his muscle, or just his presence had helped someone. Someone said Big Ed was a friend of Jesus. Another one said Big Ed was just like Jesus. I couldn't help thinking that maybe, just maybe, Big Ed was Jesus. I kept remembering that Ed promised he would return. Last time I was in the neighborhood, I thought I might have seen him, kneeling down helping someone who was lost on the street. About 2 years ago, as I was walking near my old apartment, I was overwhelmed by Ed's presence. I still miss him. I love that man. I hope you noticed that I used the present tense. I love Big Ed. To this day, I can feel Big Ed's love for his neighbors. Big Ed lives in me, just as surely as he lives in every one of the characters he ever loved. I know that Ed lives. I also know that there will come a day when I'm going to have to answer to that big red engine for having the audacity to bring him inside this very church. I trust Ed to forgive me, because it's Easter, and that's what I do. At Easter, I hang out by the empty tomb and tell resurrection stories. Stories about how the divine in us suffers and is broken. Stories about how the things that are Christ-like in us are crucified, and how all that is Christ-like in us rises up again and again as love. Joyous Easter. Peace, everybody. Bye for now.